Welcome to our tutorial for question 16 of our weekly review. Question 16 is asking us to compare two figures on the coordinate plane and determine if those figures are congruent, similar, or neither. And we're also asked if our figures are congruent to describe the types of transformations that have occurred. I'll remind you that we discussed transformations in our video for question 15, so if you need to go back and review that, please do. First, let's describe what we mean when we say congruent. Congruent are simply shapes where all sides and angles are exactly the same. Please make sure, though, that you note that this doesn't mean that the position or orientation has to be the same as well. It is possible for congruent figures to be rotated, to be translated, or to be reflected. Those were our rigid transformations that we talked about in question 15. So anytime you see a rigid transformation, we know those shapes are congruent or exactly the same shapes. When we describe similar shapes, we're describing shapes where all of the angles of the shapes are the same. However, all of the sides are proportional, having changed by a common scale factor. And again, relating this to question 15, these are going to be dilations where our shape has either gotten bigger or smaller, but is still in proportion to itself. And then obviously, if the shapes that we're looking at don't meet either of these definitions, then we would simply say that neither of those things were true. And again, a reminder that all congruent shapes can involve rigid transformations, and all of our rigid transformations will be describing congruent figures. Dilations will describe similar figures, and those are our non-rigid transformations, though I will tell you there are some other non-rigid transformations you'll learn about later that are not necessarily similar. So let's go ahead and take a look at this figure here. Just by looking at this, I'm going to notice that those shapes look exactly the same. In fact, if I was to take the orange shape and change how it's oriented on the paper, I'm going to notice that it's going to overlay exactly. So these would be what would be called congruent figures. And if I was to describe the transformation that took place, I would say that it rotated. It spun around using those vocabulary words that we talked about in question 15. We can also have figures that look exactly like this, and in this case, these are congruent figures that have been translated. The orientation is the same, it's simply the location or the position that has changed in this example. And one of the things that you're going to notice on this triangle is we've got some curved lines on our angles, and we also have some lines that run through those sides. Those are actually symbols that we use to describe that our sides are congruent. So we know that the side with one mark on it is the exact same as the side with one mark on it, and the side with 3 marks is exactly the same as the other side with 3 marks. So just make sure that you remember that. Those are clues that we're working with similar or congruent shapes. And here again is another example where I can tell all of the sides of this are the same. I started with 5 centimeters on the top, 4 centimeters on the side, and 3 centimeters on the bottom. I have all of those same things. So this is indeed a congruent shape. And in this case, I would describe the transformation that happened as actually 2 transformations, which can occur. And I would say that this would show a reflection. I would reflect this across the y-axis. And then there was some type of rotation that took place after that reflection happened. Next, let's go ahead and look at some things that are not congruent. And I can tell right away that these are not congruent because the sides are not exactly the same. However, I do have some clues that our angles are the same. Remember that we know when we see those marks, that tells us that those angles are the same. So I know that the bottom angle is the same as the bottom angle. And I also know that the top angle is the same as the top angle, and I also know that the side angle is the same as the side angle. Those symbols are telling me that those angles are the same. But I'm going to notice that I'm not working with the same side lengths. This tells me that my shapes are not congruent, but they still might be similar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare each side with the corresponding shape. So I've marked the left side in green, and I'm going to think about what I need to multiply 12 by to get 8. In this case, I'm going to multiply 12 by 2/3, and I'm going to get 8. If that scale factor, or the number that I multiplied by, is the same for all three sides, then our shapes are what we would call similar shapes. So I can do my next side. I'll do 18 and 12, compare that, and 18 times 2/3 does equal 12. And my final side, 27 and 18, and 27 and 18 do in fact, or 27 times 2/3 does in fact equal 18. So these are what we would call similar shapes. Now, again, in order for them to be similar, the scale factor that I multiplied each of those sides by must be the same. In this example, they were 2/3. I don't need to describe any type of transformation that took place here. This is simply a dilation. Next, I'm going to take a look at this example. I'm going to notice that I do have some marks that tell me that I have some things that are the same. Here I'm going to notice that those angles are exactly the same. I'm also going to notice that my side BC is exactly the same as my side EF. They're the same lengths. And I can also notice that my side AC is the same as the side DF. However, just by looking at that shape, I'm going to notice it's still a triangle, but that triangle looks different. And this is an example of a shape that is neither similar or congruent. In this case, we had one angle that stayed the same. We had two sides that stayed the same, but not all of the sides and angles were the same. And certainly, if I have if I had two sides that were the same, and one side that changed by a different amount, so this one changed by a different amount, then it is not going to be similar or congruent. Again, if you need help with transformations, make sure you refer back to question 15, which describes how we can find and describe the transformations that occur with shapes on the coordinate plane.